Welcome back to the channel. If you are new at our channel, don't forget to like and subscribe. Have you ever loved someone who seemed distant? Someone who cared, but always kept you just out of reach? They weren't cold, just guarded. And every time things got close, they'd pull away, leaving you wondering if they ever really felt anything at all. But what if I told you that distance wasn't rejection, it was fear? Because for someone with avoidant tendencies, love isn't easy. It's terrifying. So when an avoidant starts to fall in love, you won't see it in their words. You'll see it in the smallest shifts, the quiet consistencies, the moments they stay instead of run. And that's when everything changes.
You'll know an avoidant is starting to love you when something subtle but powerful begins to shift. Their emotional consistency replaces their emotional distance. It doesn't happen overnight. It's not a grand confession or a romantic outburst. It's gradual, quiet, and deeply significant. For someone with avoidant tendencies, closeness is not comfort, it's exposure. It's like standing in front of a bright light after years in the dark. They squint, they hesitate, and yet, they don't walk away this time. Avoidants are driven by one deep fear, the fear of losing themselves in connection. Love to them feels like surrendering control. So when you first meet them, they appear calm, composed, and independent. But that independence is often a fortress. They're not just guarding their freedom, they're guarding their vulnerability. And the paradox is that while they crave love, they've trained themselves to survive without it. They've learned to find safety in emotional distance, not in intimacy. So when they begin to show up consistently, when their pattern of withdrawal starts to break, that's not just behavioral change. That's emotional courage. It's the nervous system adapting to love. Their body is learning that your presence is not a threat. The nervous system is everything here. Avoidants live in a hyper, independent state, wired for self-protection. Their attachment system has learned closeness equals danger. So when they start replying faster, when they start showing up even after conflict, when they stop using silence as a shield, they're not just choosing you, they're reprogramming a lifetime of conditioning. What makes this so important is that consistency is not natural for them in emotional spaces. It's earned. It's built through safety, not pressure. The moment you try to force an avoidant to open up, they retreat. But when they begin to trust that you'll stay steady no matter what, their defenses start to soften. You become a space where they can exist without the fear of being consumed. And this is where most people misread the signs. They assume an avoidance love will look like overt affection or words of affirmation. But for the avoidant, love often looks like not disappearing. It's in their predictability. It's in the text that comes at 9 a.m. when it used to come days later. It's in the small moments where they choose to remain emotionally present, even when it feels uncomfortable. Their consistency is their confession. Psychologically, what's happening is profound. The avoidant is moving from a fear-based attachment pattern toward a secure one. It's the internal shift from I need to protect myself from love to I can be safe within love. That's an evolution. You're witnessing growth that was once unthinkable. And if you're the one on the receiving end, you have to understand that this shift requires patience. You can't rush emotional evolution. You can only nurture it through stability, honesty, and non-reactivity. It's also worth noting that avoidants love through actions, not declarations. They rarely say, I love you, first, but they might remember something small you said weeks ago. They might start prioritizing time with you, even though solitude has always been their refuge. They'll start managing their own triggers better, just to avoid pushing you away. These are not small gestures. These are monumental steps for someone whose entire emotional framework was built around avoidance. And what drives that transformation is not pressure, but safety. When an avoidant starts feeling that your presence doesn't demand their constant performance, that they can simply be, that's when the walls begin to crumble. They realize that connection doesn't mean losing autonomy, it means sharing space. Two sovereign individuals building trust through reliability. Consistency, in this sense, is the most authentic love language of the avoidant, because it doesn't require them to abandon their nature, It allows them to evolve it. They're not becoming someone else, they're expanding who they are. Love, when it's real, doesn't destroy your defenses, it teaches them new purposes. It says, you don't have to protect yourself from me. You can rest here. So if you find yourself with an avoidant who's starting to show up differently, who's showing emotional steadiness instead of distance, understand the magnitude of what you're witnessing. You're not just seeing love unfold, you're seeing healing in motion. You're watching someone rewrite their emotional DNA, one consistent act at a time. And that's the real sign of love. Not passion, not promises, but presence. Because when the avoidant stops running, when they stay, when they choose consistency over comfort, they're saying the most powerful words they may never speak aloud. You are safe with me. When an avoidant starts to love you, one of the clearest signs isn't what they say, it's what they allow. You start noticing small invitations into their world. Maybe they let you see how they live. Maybe they share a routine, a hobby, or even a quiet moment that feels strangely intimate. It's not grand, it's not dramatic. But for them, it's enormous. Because for someone with avoidant tendencies, privacy isn't just about solitude, it's about control. It's the one domain where they feel entirely safe from the chaos of emotional exposure. To understand this shift, you have to understand the psychology beneath it. Avoidants build their lives around predictability. Their environment, their habits, their alone time, all of it is a carefully managed ecosystem of control. It's how they regulate a nervous system that doesn't trust closeness. Letting someone inside that space, literally or emotionally, disrupts the equilibrium they've spent years constructing. So when they start to open that door, even slightly, it means something fundamental has changed. It means safety has begun to outweigh fear. That moment might come when they ask for your opinion about something personal, or when they share a memory they've never told anyone before. It could be as simple as leaving a few things of yours at their place, or as profound as letting you see them when they're not composed. When they're tired, unfiltered, human. These moments may seem small to you, but to the avoidant, they're seismic. They represent trust not as an idea, but as an embodied experience. Trust for them isn't built through words, it's built through the surrender of control. Here's the paradox. The avoidant doesn't fall in love because they trust you. They begin to trust you because they're falling in love. Love challenges their defenses from the inside out. It quietly pushes against the walls they've built, not with pressure, but with presence. Over time, that presence starts to feel familiar, grounding, and safe, and the avoidant realizes, perhaps for the first time, that connection doesn't have to cost them freedom, it can coexist with it. This is why when they start inviting you into their private world, you have to move with awareness. Don't mistake their openness as permission to invade. The avoidant opens up in small, calculated increments, testing to see if the environment remains safe when they reveal more of themselves. How you respond in those moments will either deepen their trust or reinforce their fear. If you meet their vulnerability with acceptance instead of analysis, they learn that intimacy doesn't equal loss of self. There's also something deeply philosophical happening beneath this. For the avoidant, love becomes a confrontation with the illusion of control. They start realizing that to be fully alive, they have to risk being seen. That's a terrifying concept for someone whose entire identity has been shaped around self-sufficiency. But love, in its purest form, dismantles isolation. It says, you don't have to do life alone. And when the avoidant finally begins to internalize that, they don't just let you into their home or their schedule, they let you into their emotional ecosystem. That's sacred territory. You might notice this through subtle acts. They start sharing the music they actually listen to when they're alone. They talk about their past, not just in facts, but in feelings. They show you the things they care about, but never talk about. The book they've read 10 times, the playlist they made years ago, the dreams they never pursued. These are not random details. These are pieces of identity they've hidden because showing them feels like giving someone access to their core. And in love, that's exactly what they're beginning to do. Psychologically, This marks a transition from detachment to integration. The avoidant is no longer separating love from self. They're learning that intimacy doesn't annihilate individuality, it enriches it. And that's the real healing, because love isn't supposed to erase who you are, it's supposed to expand you. The avoidant, for perhaps the first time, begins to experience that expansion. They begin to understand that allowing someone in doesn't mean losing themselves. It means finding a deeper version of who they are through connection. But this stage also demands patience. When an avoidant starts opening up, it's fragile. One misstep, one sign of judgment, one hint of emotional manipulation can send them retreating back into isolation. That's why love, in this context, isn't about intensity, it's about steadiness. The energy has to be calm, consistent, non-threatening. You don't need to chase them through the door they've opened. You just need to stand where you are and let them meet you there at their pace. That's what makes the connection sustainable. When you finally see an avoidant letting you in, really letting you in, you're not just witnessing affection, you're witnessing transformation. It's not about the act itself, it's about what it represents: the choice to be seen, to be known, and to risk being loved. That's an act of courage far greater than any verbal confession. So when that moment comes, don't overlook it. Don't minimize it. See it for what it is: the quiet, unmistakable signal that love has begun to rewire fear. Because when an avoidant lets you into their private world, they're not just making space in their life, they're making space in their heart. And that's when you know love has started to feel like home. One of the most revealing signs that an avoidant is starting to fall in love is when their need for control begins to soften. You'll notice a quiet shift from rigid independence toward emotional cooperation. It doesn't mean they suddenly become expressive or dependent. It means they start to include you in their process. They begin to see connection not as a threat to their freedom, but as a shared rhythm where both people move in sync without losing themselves. That's a massive psychological leap for someone who has spent years protecting their autonomy at all costs. Avoidants often equate control with safety. They've learned that when they're in charge of the situation, when they decide when to engage, when to pull back, what to share, what to hide, they can prevent rejection, judgment, or abandonment. It's not about dominance, it's about survival. Control is the mechanism that keeps their emotional world predictable. Love, however, is unpredictable by nature. It demands vulnerability, and vulnerability feels like chaos to an avoidant nervous system. So when they start letting go, even in small ways, it's not weakness, it's the deepest form of courage. You might notice this change in subtle, everyday dynamics. And maybe they stop canceling plans at the last minute. Maybe they start compromising, letting you choose the restaurant, making time even when they'd normally retreat into solitude. Or perhaps, after a disagreement, they don't stonewall or vanish like they used to. They come back to the table. They talk. They try. These moments might seem ordinary, but they are revolutionary for an avoidant. What's really happening beneath those behaviors is a recalibration of the nervous system. They're learning to coexist with uncertainty. They're discovering that intimacy doesn't require total control, it requires trust. Psychologically, this shift marks a transition from self-preservation to co-regulation. Early on, an avoidant regulates their emotions alone. That's how they manage fear, by retreating, by overthinking, by restoring order within themselves. But when they start to love someone, their emotional regulation begins to involve another person. They start to feel safe enough to lean, even slightly, on someone else. And that's not dependency. It's maturity. It's the recognition that two people can hold space for one another without erasing their individual strength. It's fascinating because this isn't just emotional. It's physiological. Love starts changing the body's relationship with stress. When an avoidant begins to cooperate emotionally, their brain is essentially learning that connection can be a regulator, not a threat. Oxytocin, the bonding hormone, begins to override cortisol, the stress hormone. That's why over time, closeness becomes less overwhelming and more grounding. What once triggered their fear of suffocation now begins to feel like balance. And here's the deeper philosophical truth. Love that's built on control isn't love, it's management. Control keeps things stable but sterile. Cooperation brings life, movement, and depth. For an avoidant, learning to cooperate emotionally means embracing the unknown, surrendering the illusion that they can plan or protect their way through intimacy. They start understanding that real strength isn't about avoiding pain, it's about growing resilient enough to stay open in the face of it. This change often reveals itself during moments of friction. When tension arises, an avoidant who hasn't opened up yet will shut down or withdraw. But a loving avoidant, the one who's evolving, will do something completely new. They'll stay. Maybe uncomfortably, maybe awkwardly, but they'll stay. They'll ask, "Can we talk about this?" Or, "I didn't like how that felt, but I don't want to lose you." That's monumental. It means their love has started to override their instinct for self-protection. And the beauty of it is that once this shift happens, it tends to sustain itself. Emotional cooperation becomes reinforcing. It builds connection through every act of shared vulnerability. The more they engage, the safer they feel. The safer they feel, the more they engage. That's how healing happens. Not through grand emotional breakthroughs, but through consistent participation in the relationship as a living, breathing system. Of course, patience is critical during this stage. You can't rush someone out of their defenses. The goal isn't to make them surrender, it's to help them feel safe enough to share control. You're not taking power from them, you're showing them that partnership doesn't require power struggles. It requires alignment. It's two people rowing the same boat in the same direction, each trusting that the other won't let them drift off course. That's why when an avoidant starts cooperating, when they stop needing to control every interaction, you're witnessing something far deeper than compromise. You're witnessing the transformation of fear into trust, autonomy into partnership, and survival into connection. And once that shift takes hold, love becomes less of a battlefield and more of a dance. It's not about who leads or who follows. It's about learning to move together. Because in the end, that's what real love teaches, that control is an illusion, but cooperation is freedom. When an avoidant learns to soften, to share, to trust the flow instead of fighting it, that's when love stops feeling like a risk and starts feeling like peace. You'll know an avoidant is truly beginning to love you when they start doing something that goes completely against their nature. They communicate, even when it's hard. That might not sound like a big deal at first, but for an avoidant, communication in emotionally charged moments feels like standing in front of a fire without armor. It burns. It exposes. It forces them to sit in feelings they've spent a lifetime running from. So when they begin to talk through the hard things, instead of retreating into silence, you're witnessing something extraordinary. You're watching love override fear. Avoidants are not wired to process emotion externally. Their coping mechanism has always been withdrawal. Distance gives them control. Silence gives them safety. When they feel overwhelmed, their instinct is to shut down, not because they don't care, but because they care too much and don't know how to handle the flood of emotion that comes with it. They disappear not out of malice, but out of protection. For themselves and sometimes even for you, it's the only way they know how to regain equilibrium. So when they stop doing that, when they choose to speak rather than vanish, that's not just behavioral change, it's emotional evolution. What's actually happening inside them at that moment is a neurological and psychological recalibration. Their nervous system, which used to associate confrontation with threat, is beginning to associate it with connection. Communication becomes the new coping mechanism. It's uncomfortable, sometimes painfully so, but it's progress. They start realizing that expressing themselves doesn't always lead to conflict. It can lead to understanding. And that's when something profound happens. Vulnerability starts replacing avoidance as their default strategy. You'll notice this shift in small, deliberate moments. Maybe they start texting you after an argument instead of going silent for days. Maybe they say, "I need some time to think, but I'll come back to talk about it." That statement, simple as it sounds, is monumental. It means they're not running, they're pausing. They're learning to stay emotionally engaged without losing themselves. That's a breakthrough. Because for an avoidant, communication during emotional stress is not about words, it's about presence. It's about saying, I'm here, even though this is hard for me. This transformation doesn't happen because they suddenly become skilled communicators. It happens because love begins to feel safer than silence. The relationship starts to redefine what safety means for them. Safety is no longer solitude, it's honesty. It's the relief of being seen and not punished for it. And when that shift occurs, the entire dynamic of the relationship changes. Conflict stops feeling like a battlefield and starts feeling like a bridge. Philosophically, what's happening is even more profound. The avoidant is learning the essence of relational courage, the ability to remain connected while uncomfortable. Most people think courage is about grand gestures or fearless declarations. But in love, courage is often quieter. It's the act of staying in the conversation when every part of you wants to flee. It's saying, I don't have all the words, but I'm trying. That's what makes love transformative. It teaches us to stay human in moments we'd rather shut down. Communication also becomes the medium through which the avoidant begins to build emotional intimacy. Every time they share a feeling, admit a mistake, or express confusion, they're rewiring old beliefs about love. They're proving to themselves that being vulnerable doesn't automatically lead to rejection. That realization, once it takes root, changes everything. It turns emotional transparency from a threat into a strength. But here's the thing, when this stage begins, it's fragile. The avoidance attempts at communication might come out clumsy, defensive, even cold at times. They're not experts at expressing emotion. They're beginners learning a new language. If you meet those early efforts with criticism or sarcasm, they'll shut down again. But if you meet them with patience, curiosity, and steadiness, they'll learn that it's safe to keep speaking. And slowly, communication becomes their new form of connection. You'll start to notice that their tone changes. They begin to ask how you feel. They begin to explain instead of withdraw. They don't just communicate to fix problems. They communicate to understand. And that's when you realize the avoidant is no longer trying to avoid love. They're learning how to sustain it. The walls they built to survive are being replaced by bridges built to connect. The truth is, communication is the point where love becomes conscious. It's where instinct gives way to intention. The avoidant, once ruled by subconscious fear, begins to act from conscious choice. They start choosing honesty over comfort, connection over silence, and truth over avoidance. That's what real love does. It makes you face yourself and grow. So when an avoidant finally starts to talk instead of retreat, listen closely. Don't just hear their words. Feel the courage behind them. Because in those moments, they're not just communicating with you, they're communicating with their own fear. They're saying to themselves, I can do this. I can stay. I can love without running. And that's when you know something beautiful has begun. Their fear is no longer in control. Love is. You'll know an avoidant truly loves you when they do something that used to feel impossible for them. They stay during emotional discomfort. They stop running when things get hard. They stop disappearing when tension rises. They stop shutting down when feelings get messy. Instead, they remain, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes quietly, but they stay. And that simple act of staying might not seem like much on the surface, but for an avoidant, it's everything. It's the clearest signal that love has begun to outweigh fear. Avoidants are wired for emotional self-preservation. When conflict, vulnerability, or intensity enters the room, their instinct is to retreat. Their nervous system reads closeness as danger. They've learned that the fastest way to feel safe again is to create distance, to withdraw, to go silent, to rebuild control from behind emotional walls. So when they choose to remain present in a moment that would normally trigger their flight response, that's not weakness. That's mastery. It's the nervous system learning a new rhythm. It's love teaching the body that connection doesn't equal danger. This is where emotional growth becomes visible. You start to notice it in small but powerful ways. They no longer storm out of the room mid-conversation. They don't ghost you for days when something uncomfortable comes up. Instead, they breathe through it. They might not have the right words, they might look tense, but they're grounded enough to endure the discomfort. They're learning to regulate their emotions in connection rather than in isolation. And that's the beginning of emotional maturity, learning to stay even when every part of you wants to run. What's really happening underneath is a profound psychological reconditioning. The avoidance inner belief system is shifting from closeness will hurt me to closeness can heal me. That transition doesn't come from being pushed. It comes from consistent experiences of safety. Every time they stay and the world doesn't collapse, their brain rewrites an old story. The old story says, if I show up emotionally, I'll lose control. The new story says, if I show up emotionally, I can still be safe. That's not just healing, that's transformation at the deepest level of attachment. You'll also notice that when they stay, they start to engage differently. Their body language softens. Their tone evens out. They start listening, not just reacting, because for the first time, they're not trying to escape the moment. They're trying to understand it. They're not fighting for control. They're learning to coexist with uncertainty. And that's what love really demands. Staying grounded in the presence of discomfort, not because it's easy, but because it matters. Philosophically, this shift represents the evolution from self-protection to relational courage. The avoidant begins to realize that avoidance doesn't prevent pain, it prolongs it. Running from discomfort keeps them trapped in the same emotional loops, never growing, never trusting, never feeling the fullness of life. Staying, on the other hand, becomes an act of liberation. It's saying, I choose to face what scares me instead of repeating what numbs me. That's how love becomes a teacher. It transforms pain into growth, discomfort into depth, fear into faith. This stage is where relationships with avoidance can start to feel truly balanced. When they stay, you stop being the only one holding the emotional weight. You start to feel their presence, not just their distance. You see them take accountability. You see them trying to bridge the gap instead of widening it. It might not look perfect. There will still be moments of retreat. But the direction changes. They begin to return faster. They begin to repair instead of withdraw. And every return strengthens the emotional muscle of connection. Now, it's important to understand that staying doesn't mean they no longer feel fear. The fear is still there. The difference is, love gives them something stronger to stand on. It gives them a reason to confront what once made them run. Love becomes the anchor that keeps them from drifting back into isolation. And that's not something you can force. It's something that grows naturally through trust, patience, and emotional steadiness. When they feel your calm energy instead of pressure, they find the courage to remain. Sometimes the avoidant will stay not through words, but through presence. They'll sit next to you in silence after an argument. They'll make dinner even though the air feels heavy. They'll check in later with a simple, "Are we okay?" That's love expressed in their language. It's not the dramatic reconciliation you see in movies. It's the quiet choice to keep showing up. And in that quietness lies their deepest expression of commitment. Ultimately, when an avoidant chooses to stay, they're breaking a lifelong pattern. They're teaching their mind and body that love isn't something to escape. It's something to lean into. They're stepping into the unknown, guided not by certainty, but by faith and connection. And that's a profound act of transformation, because love isn't proven in moments of comfort. It's proven in moments of discomfort. The real measure of love isn't how easily someone stays when things are light and effortless, but how they stay when it's hard, when it's messy, when it requires growth. So when an avoidant stops running and begins to remain, don't miss the significance. That's not just them loving you, it's them learning to love through you. And that's the most powerful kind of love there is. One of the clearest signs that an avoidant has fallen in love is when their actions begin to speak louder than their avoidance ever did. You'll see it not through grand declarations, but through quiet, consistent acts of service. They start doing things for you, not out of obligation, not to earn approval, but because something inside them has shifted. Love, for them, has become safe enough to express through action. And when that happens, you're not just witnessing affection, you're witnessing trust in motion. Avoidants often struggle with direct emotional expression. Words like, I love you, or I miss you, can feel too vulnerable, too exposing. But action gives them another language, one that feels safer yet equally meaningful. They'll fix something you mentioned offhandedly. They'll remember what brand of tea you like and keep it stocked. They'll drive across town to make sure you get home safely. To them, these gestures are communication. They're saying, I see you, I value you, and I want to make your life easier. And for someone who once built their world around self-sufficiency, that's an extraordinary act of openness. Psychologically, what's happening here is a merging of care and security. The avoidant begins to associate love not with loss of control, but with contribution. They stop guarding their energy so fiercely and start investing it in someone else. That's a huge shift. Because for most of their life, giving has felt dangerous. Giving meant risking depletion, disappointment, or dependence. But when they feel safe, when the relationship no longer triggers survival mode, they start to experience the joy of giving without fear of losing themselves. Acts of service become the bridge between independence and intimacy. And if you pay attention, you'll notice a subtle pattern. They begin to anticipate your needs. They'll sense when you're stressed and step in before you ask. They'll remember things you forgot you told them. They'll start showing up in moments where they once would have stayed detached. These aren't random gestures. They're deliberate, thoughtful actions that say, you matter. For the avoidant, love is not about intensity, it's about reliability. It's about proving, through consistency, that their care can be trusted. This is also where you see the deepest philosophical truth about love. It's not just emotion, it's devotion. It's the choice to keep showing up, even when words fall short. The avoidant begins to embody that truth. Their actions become the external reflection of an internal transformation. What used to be fear, driven independence turns into love, driven generosity. They start realizing that service isn't submission, it's connection. It's not about losing power, it's about sharing energy in a way that creates stability. From a relational psychology standpoint, this behavior represents integration. The avoidant is no longer compartmentalizing love and safety. They're living them simultaneously. Their nervous system has recalibrated enough to allow affection without triggering panic. Acts of service become the proof that their love is no longer defensive, it's creative. They're building, nurturing, maintaining. And this is critical because love isn't just about emotion, it's about energy management. How you give your time, attention, and effort defines the depth of your bond. Now, it's important to understand that these gestures might look simple to an outsider, but to the avoidant, they're monumental. Making you breakfast, offering to help with something, remembering the details. They're not just doing these things to please you, they're doing them to connect. For someone who has spent years protecting their independence, every act of service is a small surrender. It's them saying, I trust you enough to give you my energy. That's sacred ground. And as this continues, something beautiful begins to happen. Service stops being a task and becomes a rhythm. They don't do it to prove love. They do it because love has become their natural state. Their guarded edges soften. Their world becomes less about boundaries and more about balance. They discover that giving doesn't drain them, it fills them. Because when love is safe, giving becomes renewal. It's the soul's way of expanding beyond self, preservation into genuine connection. This is also when you start to feel their presence in a different way. You no longer have to wonder if they care. You can feel it in the reliability of their actions. Their love becomes practical, embodied, grounded. It's in the details. It's in the quiet. It's in the way they make sure you're okay without needing recognition. And that's the thing. Avoidants don't serve to be noticed. They serve because it's how they say, I'm with you. It's how they demonstrate love without the vulnerability of words they still struggle to say. Ultimately, this stage completes the arc of transformation. The avoidant, once defined by emotional distance, becomes defined by emotional integrity. Their care is no longer reactive, it's intentional. They're not acting out of fear of loss, they're acting out of desire to contribute. And that's the deepest sign of love, not passion, not possession, but the willingness to give of yourself freely with no agenda other than connection, because love, at its core, is not proven through promises or words. It's proven through presence, through the small, consistent acts that say, "You can rely on me." And when an avoidant begins to love this way, you'll know they've found peace within the very thing they once feared. They've discovered that giving doesn't make them vulnerable, it makes them whole. And that's when love stops being something they avoid and finally becomes something they live.